The dust swirled in angry red clouds across the barren plain. Genevieve Parker wasn't just crying. She was screaming. Her fists beat a raw, bloody rhythm against the Montana dirt, each blow a punctuation mark to a pain so deep it had no words. Hours, it must have been hours. Her fine riding skirt was a ruin of earth and tears. The telegram, the hateful piece of paper that had shattered her world, lay crumpled beside her. My brother is dead. The words were a brand on her soul. Frank Dawson heard the screaming from the next ridge over. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was human, and it was the sound of a soul being torn apart. He spurred his horse, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. When he saw her, a lone figure in dusty blue hammering the unyielding ground, he knew he was riding into something heavy. He dismounted slow, like he was approaching a wolf caught in a trap. He was a man who understood grief. He'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers, in the hollowed faces of widows. But this was different. This was a storm. He stood a ways off, hat in his hands. He didn't say a word. Sometimes silence was the only thing that made sense. He just settled on a rock and waited. He knew the storm would have to break on its own. Genevieve slowly became aware of him, a shape, a man, watching her. Shame tried to rise, but the grief was a tidal wave that washed it away. What did it matter? Nothing mattered. "Go away," she croaked, her voice sandpaper. The man didn't move. "Can't do that, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Storm's coming. A real one." She glanced up. Dark clouds boiled on the horizon. She hadn't noticed. "I don't care." "I understand," the man said. "But your horse might." Her horse. Penny, standing patiently a dozen yards away, ears twitching nervously. Another crack appeared in the dam of her control. "I can't," she whispered. "Can't move. Can't think. Can't breathe in a world where Michael wasn't." "My name's Frank Dawson," the man said, still keeping his distance. "Got a cabin a couple miles east. Shelter for you and the horse." She finally looked at him. Really looked at him. He was weathered, solid. His eyes were a startling blue, and in their depths, she saw something she didn't expect. Not pity, something else, something steady. But as he stood, he shifted his weight, and for a split second, the butt of a holstered pistol peeked from under his duster. This was no simple rancher. "Genevieve Parker," she said, the name a ghost on her lips. He offered a hand. She stared at it, her own hand raw and trembling. She finally took it. As she rose, the world tilted, her legs giving way. Frank caught her, his grip like iron. "My brother!" The words tore from her. "He's dead! Killed in a saloon fight in Deadwood." Frank nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Parker." But his eyes, they weren't just looking at her. They were scanning the horizon, as if he was expecting something, or someone. "Rain's coming," he said, his voice a low command. "We need to move." He lifted her onto her horse with an ease that spoke of immense strength. As they rode toward the dark smudge of his cabin, the first drops of rain began to fall, cold as grave dirt. Genevieve clutched the crumpled telegram in her pocket. It felt heavier now, not just with grief, but with a new, chilling weight. The telegram had said Michael was killed in a fight. But there was one more line. A line she hadn't told the stranger. Trust no one. Frank Dawson's cabin was small, but built like a fortress. The logs were thick, the windows were high and narrow. It wasn't a home, it was a holdout. The rain was a torrent by the time they got the horses into the small, sturdy barn. Inside the cabin, a fire was already laid in the stone hearth, ready to be lit. Odd, as if he'd been expecting to leave in a hurry and come back just as fast. "There's dry clothes behind the curtain," he said, gesturing to a sleeping alcove. "I'll be outside." He didn't go to chop wood. He went to the barn. And through the sheeting rain, Genevieve saw him. He wasn't checking on the horses. He was standing in the doorway, rifle in hand, watching their back trail. Watching for what? A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. She changed into the clothes, a flannel shirt that smelled of wood smoke and oil, trousers cinched tight with a bit of rope. They were clean, functional, the clothes of a man who lived alone and was ready for anything. When she stepped out, she saw a bookshelf, not just Bibles and almanacs. There were books on military strategy, geology, engineering. Who was Frank Dawson? He came back inside, dripping wet, the rifle now propped casually by the door. His blue eyes swept over her, taking in the sight of her in his clothes. A flicker of something crossed his face, but it was gone before she could name it. He moved to the fire, striking a match. The flames caught, casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel even more confining. "Coffee's on," he said, his back to her. She found a comb and worked through the tangles in her hair, her hands moving on their own. Her mind was a whirlwind. Grief was still there, a great tearing beast. But now it had a companion. Fear. She was alone, in a stranger's cabin, miles from anywhere, and the stranger was a mystery wrapped in contradictions. A kind man with the eyes of a hawk and the library of a general. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. It was black and bitter. "You said my brother died in a saloon fight," she said, testing him. His eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. "That's what you said, Miss Parker." "The telegram," she began, then stopped. "Trust no one." "Deadwood is a rough town," he said, his voice neutral. "Good men find bad trouble there." It sounded like a line he'd rehearsed. He put bread and dried meat on the table. She couldn't eat. Her stomach was a knot of ice. "You seem to know loss," she said, remembering his earlier quiet empathy. He nodded, his gaze distant. "Lost my family in the war. Wife to fever after that." The words should have softened him, made him just a man with his own ghosts. But instead, they felt like another carefully constructed wall, a story told to create a connection, to build a trust that the telegram warned her against. Was any of it real? He saw the doubt in her eyes. "Time teaches you how to carry the weight," he said, his voice soft again. And for a moment she believed him. The pain in his eyes seemed genuine. But then he stood, clearing the table, and his movements were too precise, too economical. The movements of a soldier, not a rancher. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey. "Just enough to help you sleep," he said, pouring 2 glasses. She took a sip. The whiskey burned, but it was a clean fire, chasing some of the chill from her bones. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Dawson?" He hesitated. "Let's just say a man did me a kindness once when I was at my lowest. I'm just paying the debt forward." Another perfect story. Too perfect. "You have no family?" she pressed. "None," he said. And she knew with a certainty that terrified her that he was lying. She had to get out of here. But where would she go? Into the storm? Back toward Deadwood, the town where her brother was murdered and where a piece of paper told her to trust no one? "Dawn's a few hours off," Frank said, his voice gentle. "Take the bed. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Exhaustion was a drug pulling her down. She nodded, rising on shaky legs. She went behind the curtain, but she didn't lie down. She sank to the floor, her back against the rough wall, her ears straining to hear every sound. She heard him move to a chair by the fire. She heard the soft click of a rifle being checked, and then she heard him whisper a single name into the crackling flames, a name that froze the blood in her veins. Michael. He knew her brother's name. She hadn't told him. Sleep was impossible. Genevieve sat in the darkness, every nerve screaming. Frank Dawson knew her brother's name. How? Why hadn't he said anything? The man who offered her shelter was no random Samaritan. He was connected to Michael, which meant he was connected to his death. Was he the killer? Luring her into a trap? Or was he something else? The questions circled like vultures. Dawn came, painting the narrow windows in shades of gray. She heard Frank stir, the sound of him adding wood to the stove, the clink of the coffee pot. She forced herself to breathe, to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She had to play along. She had to learn more before she made a move. She emerged from behind the curtain, her borrowed clothes rumpled. Frank was at the stove, his back to her. "Morning," he said without turning. "Eggs are on." "Good morning," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. They ate in silence. The food tasted like ash in her mouth. She watched him, studying his hands, the set of his jaw. There was a coiled tension in him this morning, a watchfulness that hadn't been there the night before. "I need to get to Deadwood," she said, breaking the silence, "to see to my brother's burial." He nodded, his gaze fixed on his plate. "3 days' ride. You shouldn't go alone." "I'm more capable than I look, Mr. Dawson." "The trail's dangerous," he said, finally looking at her. His blue eyes were like chips of ice. "There are men who won't respect a woman traveling alone, men who might be looking for you." "Looking for her? Why would anyone be looking for her?" "What do you mean?" "Your brother wasn't just some drifter, Miss Parker. He was on to something big, and the men who killed him will want to make sure there are no loose ends." Her blood ran cold. "How do you know that? How did you know his name was Michael?" Frank sighed, pushing his plate away. He looked tired, and he looked dangerous. "Because Michael sent for me. He wrote to me a week ago. Said he'd hit the mother lode and that he was in trouble. He asked me to come, to watch his back." He let that sink in. "I got to Deadwood 2 days ago. I was too late." Genevieve stared at him, her mind reeling. Frank wasn't the killer. He was Michael's friend, the protector her brother had summoned. The wave of relief was so powerful it almost buckled her knees, but it was followed by a fresh wave of grief. Michael knew he was in danger. He had been scared. "Who killed him?" she whispered. "The telegram said a saloon fight." Frank snorted, a harsh, bitter sound. "That's the official story. A convenient fiction. Michael wasn't a fighter. He was shot in the back, in an alley behind the Gem Saloon. The man who runs this town, Marshal Seth Bullock, he's the one who sent that telegram, and he's the one who's covering it up. The town marshal, the law, he was behind it. Trust no one." "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The claim," Frank said, his voice low and intense. "Michael didn't just find some color. He found the source, a vein of gold so rich it could make a man a king. Bullock wants it. He killed your brother for it, and now he wants you." Suddenly, the world snapped into a terrifying new focus. She wasn't just a grieving sister. She was the heir to a fortune she never knew existed, and she was the target of a powerful, ruthless man. "He thinks you're just some soft woman from the East," Frank continued. "He expects you to ride into town, cry at the funeral, and then sell the claim to him for pennies on the dollar just to be rid of the place where your brother died. He's underestimating you." Frank's eyes burned into hers. "And he's underestimating me. So you're going to take me to Deadwood?" "I am," he said. "But we're not going in the front door. We're going to see Michael's claim first. He left something for you there. A journal. It's the proof we need to expose Bullock." He stood and grabbed his rifle from beside the door. "But we have to move fast. Bullock's men are already looking for you. They tracked you this far." Genevieve's eyes flew to the window. "They're here?" "Not yet," Frank said grimly. "But they will be. I saw their tracks this morning when I checked the perimeter. They're closing in." The fortress-like cabin suddenly made perfect sense. Frank hadn't been expecting to come back. He'd been preparing for a siege. The journey was a blur of speed and fear. Frank didn't lead them on a trail. He blazed a path through dense woods and rocky canyons, his eyes constantly scanning, his rifle always ready. He was no rancher. He was a soldier in his natural element. He pushed them hard, stopping only for moments to let the horses breathe. Genevieve learned more about him in those tense hours than she had all the day before. He'd served as a scout in the war. He knew how to read the land, how to move without being seen. He'd been a friend of her brother's for years, meeting him during a short-lived stint as a prospector before Michael convinced him to buy the nearby ranch as a cover. Michael knew the risks, Frank explained as they rested the horses in a hidden ravine. He needed someone he could trust nearby, someone who could handle trouble. I was supposed to be his insurance policy. His voice was laced with guilt. I failed him. You didn't fail him, Genevieve said, her own voice fierce. You're here now. You're helping me. This isn't just about helping you, Frank said, his jaw tight. This is about vengeance. By late afternoon on the second day, they arrived. It wasn't a town, but a gash in the earth, a crude camp carved into a hillside. Michael's claim. A small, rough-hewn cabin stood beside the dark mouth of a mine. This was it. The place her brother had poured his dreams into. The place that had gotten him killed. The journal's inside, Frank said, dismounting and pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the bunk. Get it. I'll keep watch. Genevieve scrambled off her horse, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pushed open the cabin door. It was just as Frank had described Michael's life. Sparse, neat. A bunk, a table, a few books. She knelt by the bunk, her fingers searching for the loose board. She found it. Beneath it was a small, leather-bound journal. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. This was Michael's voice, his last words. She opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was rushed, frantic. Bullock knows. He came to the claim today with his deputies. Made an offer. Said I should take on a partner, for my own protection. I know what he meant. He wants it all. I sent word to Frank. God, I hope he gets here in time. I'm hiding this. If anything happens to me, this journal is the proof. The assay reports are with it. The truth is in here. Don't let him get it. Suddenly, a rifle shot cracked through the silence. Genevieve screamed, dropping the journal. Another shot splintered the wood of the doorframe. They're here! Frank roared from outside. Get down! She scrambled under the small wooden table, clutching the journal to her chest. She could hear shouting, the thunder of more gunshots, the whinny of a terrified horse. This was it. Bullock had found them. The battle for Michael's legacy had begun. The cabin offered little protection. Bullets tore through the thin walls, sending splinters flying like deadly shrapnel. Genevieve flattened herself against the floor, the journal clutched in a white-knuckled grip. She could hear Frank outside, his rifle answering the attackers with methodical, spaced shots. He was outnumbered, she knew that much from the cacophony of gunfire. Genevieve! He yelled, his voice strained. The back window! She crawled toward the rear of the cabin, the floorboards vibrating with each gunshot. There was a small, shuttered window, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers numb with terror. It swung open to a steep, wooded hillside. Go! Frank shouted. Get to the trees! Follow the creek down! I'll hold them off! Leave him. The thought was impossible. He was fighting for her, for Michael. But staying was suicide. He was buying her time. She had to use it. She shoved the precious journal inside her shirt, took a deep breath, and scrambled through the window, tumbling down a short embankment into a thicket of bushes. She didn't look back. She ran. The woods were a chaotic maze of trees and rocks. Branches clawed at her face and clothes. Her lungs burned. The sounds of the gunfight grew fainter behind her, replaced by the roar of blood in her ears. She found the creek, a silver thread tumbling over rocks, and plunged into the icy water, letting it guide her downstream, away from the fight. She didn't know how long she ran. Time had dissolved into a panicked haze. Eventually, exhaustion forced her to a stop. She collapsed behind a large boulder, gasping for breath, her body shaking uncontrollably. Was Frank dead? Had she led him to his death? The guilt was a physical blow, but then she felt the hard shape of the journal pressed against her ribs. This was why he'd sent her away. The proof, the truth. His sacrifice would be for nothing if she didn't get it to someone who could help. But who? The law in Deadwood was the killer. The whole town was under Bullock's thumb. She was alone. As darkness fell, a new, chilling sound reached her. The baying of hounds. They weren't just men anymore. They were hunters. And she was the prey. She forced her aching body to move again, stumbling through the darkness, the sounds of the dogs growing steadily closer. They were going to run her to ground and kill her, just like they'd killed her brother. She was about to give up, to simply lie down and wait for the end when she saw it. A faint light, flickering through the trees, a campfire. Hope, fragile and desperate, flared in her chest. A prospector? A trapper? Anyone was better than Bullock's men. She pushed toward the light, emerging into a small clearing. A man sat by the fire, sharpening a large knife. He looked up as she stumbled out of the woods, his eyes widening in surprise. He was grizzled, hard-looking, with a nasty scar that puckered his left cheek, but he wasn't wearing a deputy's badge. "Help me," she gasped, before her legs finally gave out and she pitched forward into the dirt. The man was on his feet in an instant, the knife still in his hand. He stared down at her, his expression a mixture of suspicion and surprise. She looked like something the cat had dragged in and then abandoned. Torn clothes, face scratched, half drowned and shaking like a leaf. "Who's after you?" he grunted, his voice like gravel. "The marshal," she choked out. "Marshal Bullock. He's trying to kill me." The man's eyes narrowed. He sheathed his knife and knelt beside her, turning her over. He saw the terror in her eyes, and it seemed to convince him. "Bullock!" He spat the name like a curse. "That figures!" He looked past her, into the darkness. The baying of the hounds was closer now, a chorus of doom. "Can't stay here," he said, pulling her to her feet. "He's got the devil's own dogs. They'll find us in minutes." He kicked dirt over his fire, plunging the clearing into near-total darkness. "Name's Jeb. You?" "Genevieve Parker." "Well, Genevieve Parker," Jeb said, grabbing a rifle and a heavy-looking pack. "Looks like you've stumbled into my war." He grabbed her arm. "This way, and be quiet if you want to keep breathing." He led her not away from the dogs, but toward a sheer rock face at the edge of the clearing. He pulled aside a curtain of thick ivy, revealing a narrow crack in the stone. A cave. "In here," he whispered, pushing her inside. The cave was small and smelled of damp earth. Jeb followed her in, pulling the ivy back into place. "They'll follow your scent to the clearing," he murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "But the creek and these rocks will confuse the dogs. Might buy us some time." They waited in the suffocating darkness, listening. The sounds of the dogs grew louder and louder until they were right outside, a frantic, snarling frenzy. Genevieve held her breath, convinced they would be discovered. She could hear men shouting, crashing through the undergrowth. "Her trail ends here," a voice yelled. "She must have gone to ground. Spread out." The sounds of the search continued for what felt like an eternity. Finally, reluctantly, they faded into the distance. Jeb let out a long, slow breath. "Too close," he muttered. He struck a match, lighting a small lantern. In the flickering light, his scarred face looked grim. "Why is Bullock after you?" he asked, his eyes boring into her. Genevieve hesitated, then decided she had nothing left to lose. She pulled out the journal. "My brother, Michael. He found a major gold strike. Bullock killed him for it. This journal is the proof." Jeb took the journal, his calloused thumb tracing the leather cover. "Michael Parker," he said softly. "I knew him. He was a good man. Fair. He told me he was onto something big, told me to be careful of the marshal. A look of profound sadness crossed his face. I should have warned him more strongly. You knew him? I work a small claim nearby, Jeb explained. We'd share coffee sometimes. He was smart, too smart for his own good in a town like Deadwood. He handed the journal back to her. So this is what got him killed. Frank Dawson, a friend of my brother's, he was helping me. He held them off at the cabin so I could escape. Her voice broke. I think he's dead. Jeb shook his head. Don't count Frank Dawson out so easily. I know him too. If any man could survive that, it's him. He's tougher than a $2 steak. He looked at her, his expression hardening. Bullock won't give up. He'll have the whole territory crawling with his men by morning. We can't stay here. Where can we go? Jeb's mouth twisted into a grim smile. There's a place. An old network of mining tunnels from the first gold rush. They honeycomb this whole mountain. Bullock doesn't know about the back entrance. We can use them to get into Deadwood, right under his nose. The plan was insane. Sneak into the heart of the enemy's territory, but it was also the last thing Bullock would expect. Why are you helping me? Genevieve asked, bewildered by this stranger's willingness to risk his life. Jeb's gaze darkened. Let's just say the marshal and I have unfinished business. He took something from me a long time ago. My claim, my livelihood, left me for dead. Helping you settle your score with him will be settling my own. He shouldered his pack. We move at first light. It's a hard climb to the tunnel entrance. Get some rest. You're going to need it. He gave her a piece of jerky and a water skin. Genevieve ate, the food giving her a sliver of strength. She was no longer just a grieving sister from Boston. She was a survivor. She had an ally, and she had the truth in her hands. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, the last thing she saw was Jeb, sitting by the cave entrance, rifle across his knees, a silent, vengeful guardian. Frank Dawson was not dead. He was, however, in a world of hurt. A bullet had grazed his temple, and another was lodged in his shoulder. After Genevieve had escaped, he'd used the last of his ammunition to make Bullock's men think he was still defending the cabin before slipping out the same back window and into the forest. He'd circled around, a ghost in the trees, watching as they stormed the empty cabin and then set the hounds on her trail. He was too injured to follow, to help. All he could do was watch the posse's lanterns disappear into the woods after her, a swarm of angry fireflies. He stumbled through the darkness, leaning heavily on his rifle, blood dripping down his arm. He had to get to Deadwood. He had to find a friendly face, someone who hated Bullock enough to help. There was only one person he could think of. A woman who ran the most respectable and most informed establishment in town, the Grand Central Hotel. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she owed him a favor. Meanwhile, the climb to the hidden tunnel was brutal. Jeb moved with the agility of a mountain goat, but Genevieve struggled, her city life having ill-prepared her for the rugged terrain. Her muscles screamed, but she pushed on, driven by a cold, hard fury. They reached the entrance just after noon, a dark fissure hidden behind a waterfall. The old-timers called this the Whispering Maw, Jeb said. Air moves through it, makes a sound like voices if the wind is right. The tunnels were a labyrinth of blackness. Jeb's lantern cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. The air was cold and stale, the silence absolute except for the dripping of water and the scuttling of unseen things. For hours they walked, Jeb navigating the maze from memory. Bullock's power comes from the Gem Saloon, Jeb explained as they walked, his voice a low rumble. It's owned by his silent partner, a man named Al Swearingen, a ruthless pig who runs all the crime in this town. The gem is where Bullock launders his money, makes his deals, and gets rid of his enemies. The tunnels run right underneath it. There's a secret entrance into the cellar. What's the plan? Genevieve asked. You're going to get cleaned up, go to the Grand Central Hotel, ask for Eleanor Vance, show her the journal, tell her Frank Dawson sent you. She's the only other person in this town who isn't afraid of Bullock. While you're doing that, I'm going to pay a visit to the gem cellar. A little bit of dynamite in the right place can cause a whole lot of chaos." They emerged, blinking, into the dusty confines of an abandoned stable on the edge of Deadwood. The town was a cacophony of noise and filth. Jeb gave her a few coins. "Get a room, act like a tourist. And Genevieve," he said, his eyes serious, "don't trust anyone else, not a soul." He melted back into the shadows, leaving her alone on the muddy street. Genevieve felt a fresh wave of fear. She was a lone woman in the deadliest town in the West, walking into the lion's den. She pulled her bonnet low, smoothed her ruined dress as best she could, and walked toward the Grand Central Hotel, the Journal a lump of lead against her heart. The hotel lobby was an oasis of civilization in the middle of chaos. A woman with silvering hair and intelligent, discerning eyes stood behind the front desk. Eleanor Vance. "I need a room," Genevieve said, her voice quiet. "And a bath." Eleanor's eyes swept over her, taking in the torn dress and exhausted face. "Of course, dear. You look like you've had a long journey." Her expression was professional, but her eyes held a spark of curiosity. Once in her room, Genevieve locked the door and collapsed. She had made it. She ran a bath, scrubbing away the dirt and fear of the last few days. As she soaked, she read the journal again, memorizing key passages, a litany of her brother's hopes and his murderer's greed. An hour later, clean and dressed in the one spare dress she had in her saddlebags, she went back downstairs. Eleanor was alone at the desk. "Mrs. Vance," Genevieve said, her voice low, "Frank Dawson sent me." Eleanor's professional mask dropped. A look of concern flashed across her face. "Frank? Is he all right? I heard there was trouble up at the old Parker claim." "He's alive, I think. He helped me escape." Genevieve slid the journal across the polished wood of the desk. "This is why." Eleanor opened the journal. She read for a long time, her expression growing harder and colder with every page she turned. When she finished, she closed it carefully. "That murdering snake," she whispered, her voice filled with venom. "I knew Bullock was crooked, but this is monstrous." She looked at Genevieve. "Your brother was a brave man, and you, my dear, are even braver for bringing this here." "What can we do?" Genevieve asked. "He controls everything." "Not everything," Eleanor said, a dangerous glint in her eye. "He doesn't control the truth, and he doesn't control the U.S. Marshals. There's a federal judge arriving on the stagecoach tomorrow from Cheyenne. He's here to look into reports of corruption in Deadwood. Your brother's journal is the bombshell we need to blow Bullock's empire apart." Suddenly, the hotel's front doors burst open. Two of Bullock's deputies stormed in, their guns drawn. "Genevieve Parker," one of them snarled, "the marshal wants a word with you." Eleanor didn't flinch. She moved with surprising speed, sweeping the journal off the desk and into a hidden compartment before the deputies could see it. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "this is a respectable establishment. You will unhand my guest and leave, now." But it was too late. One of them grabbed Genevieve's arm, his grip bruising. The other kept his gun leveled at Eleanor. The trap had been sprung. Bullock knew she was here. Just as they were dragging her toward the door, a voice came from the top of the stairs. "I'd let the lady go if I were you." It was Frank. He was pale, his left arm in a crude sling, a bloody bandage wrapped around his head. But he was standing, and in his right hand he held a Colt revolver, steady as a rock. The deputies froze. They knew Frank Dawson by reputation. They knew he wouldn't miss. The lobby was silent for a heart-stopping moment. Then from outside, a massive explosion rocked the entire town, shattering the hotel's front windows. Jeb had delivered his message to the Gem Saloon. In the ensuing chaos, Frank fired. Not at the deputies, but at the huge crystal chandelier hanging over their heads. It crashed down, trapping them in a shower of glass and metal. Frank was down the stairs in a flash, pulling Genevieve behind the overturned front desk. Eleanor was already there, a shotgun in her hands. "I always knew this day would come," Eleanor said grimly, racking a shell into the chamber. The shootout for Deadwood had just begun, right in the lobby of the Grand Central Hotel. The hotel became a war zone. Bullock's men, drawn by the explosion at the Gem and Frank's gunshot, swarmed the street outside. Gunfire erupted from all directions, shattering what was left of the windows. Frank, despite his injuries, was a deadly force, his shots precise and calculated. Eleanor, to Genevieve's astonishment, was just as formidable, her shotgun barking defiance from behind a plush armchair. "The back way!" Frank yelled over the din. "We need to get to the stagecoach depot. The judge is our only chance." He laid down covering fire while Eleanor led Genevieve through the hotel's kitchen and out into a back alley. The air was thick with smoke from the Gem, which was now burning fiercely. Jeb's diversion had turned into a full-blown inferno. People were running and screaming in the streets. Deadwood was tearing itself apart. As they ran through the maze of alleys, they saw him. Marshal Seth Bullock, his face a mask of rage, was organizing his men, trying to restore order amidst the chaos he had created. He saw them, his eyes locked with Genevieve's, and in them she saw pure, unadulterated hatred. He raised his pistol. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Bullock. It was from a rooftop above them. One of Bullock's deputies crumpled to the ground. Jeb. He had found a sniper's perch. Bullock and his remaining men were pinned down. It was the opening they needed. Frank, Genevieve, and Eleanor sprinted the last block to the stagecoach depot just as the coach from Cheyenne was pulling in, its horses spooked by the gunfire and flames. A portly man with a stern face and a thick mustache stepped out, looking aghast at the scene. Judge Harlan. "Judge!" Genevieve screamed, running toward him and shoving the journal into his hands. "Marshal Bullock murdered my brother for his gold claim. The proof is in here. He's trying to kill me to cover it up." Bullock saw what was happening. With a roar of fury, he broke cover, charging toward them, firing his pistol wildly. Frank pushed Genevieve behind the stagecoach, returning fire. A bullet caught Frank in his good leg, and he went down with a grunt of pain. Bullock was almost on them, his face contorted in a demonic snarl. This was it. He was going to kill them all. But as he raised his gun to finish Frank, the citizens of Deadwood, the miners and shopkeepers who had respected Michael Parker and who had suffered under Bullock's tyranny for too long, made their choice. A dozen rifles appeared in windows and doorways. The bartender from the Gem, the undertaker, the blacksmith. They had seen enough. Faced with the armed populace and the unyielding stare of a federal judge, Bullock's remaining deputies threw down their guns. Bullock stood alone, a king with no subjects, his corrupt empire literally burning to the ground behind him. He looked at Genevieve, his eyes full of venom. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Oh, I think it is, Marshal," said Judge Harlan, who had been rapidly flipping through Michael's journal. He snapped it shut. "Consider yourself under arrest for murder, corruption, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of by morning." Bullock made one last, desperate move. He lunged for Genevieve, but he never reached her. A single shot echoed in the sudden silence. Bullock staggered, a look of surprise on his face before collapsing into the mud. At the end of the street, Jeb stood with his rifle smoking, his personal war finally over. The aftermath was a blur. Frank was patched up by the town doctor. Bullock's entire corrupt organization was dismantled by Judge Harlan. Al Swearingen was found dead in the burned-out ruins of his saloon. Genevieve gave her testimony, her voice clear and strong, with her brother's journal as irrefutable proof. Justice, slow and bloody, had finally come to Deadwood. A week later, Genevieve stood with Frank at the cemetery, at her brother's grave. His leg was bandaged, and he leaned on a crutch, but his blue eyes were clear. The claim was legally hers, the richest strike in the Black Hills. Michael's dream was now her reality. "What will you do now?" Frank asked softly. She looked at the simple wooden cross. "I'm going to build what he wanted to build," she said. "A real town, with a school and a church, a place where good people can have a chance." She turned to look at him, her heart full of a feeling she thought had been buried forever. "But I can't do it alone. I need a partner." A slow smile spread across Frank's face. "I think I know a man who's looking for a new job." He reached out, his hand warm and strong, and took hers. In the heart of the wild, untamed West, surrounded by the ghosts of what she had lost, Genevieve Parker had found something unexpected. She had found justice. She had found a purpose. And in the steady blue eyes of the man who had saved her, she had found a home. They rebuilt Deadwood from the ashes, not as a lawless camp, but as a true community. The mine's wealth funded it all. Genevieve's school became the best in the territory. Frank, with his quiet strength, became the new marshal, a lawman who understood justice, not just power. Years later, they would stand on the porch of their home, watching their own children play in the shadow of the mountain that had cost them so much and given them everything. The dust still swirled, but it was no longer angry. It was just the peaceful dust of a life well lived, a future won from the brink of despair. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the strange, dark, and mysterious. You never know what secrets are buried just beneath the surface.